Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
If you were with us for our last deep dive, you'll know we covered how the body handles the nitrogen from amino acids.
Right. It strips it off, usually through transamination, and then sends it through the urea cycle.
But when that nitrogen is gone, you're left with something just as critical, the hydrocarbon skeletons.
Exactly. And this deep dive is focused entirely on the metabolic fate of those carbon frameworks. Where do they go? What do they become?
It sounds like, simple metabolic mapping.
It does, but the biomedical stakes really couldn't be higher.
Tell us why. Why is this specific area of biochemistry so critical, especially for our audience of college and pre-health learners?
Because the pathways we're discussing today are absolutely essential. And if they fail, the consequences are, well, they're severe.
How so?
Most of these disorders of amino acid catabolism are individually rare, but if they go undetected and untreated, the buildup of toxic intermediates often leads to irreversible brain damage.
And early mortality.
And early mortality. These are the classic inborn errors of metabolism.
Which means we're basically racing against the clock from the moment a baby is born.
Precisely. That's why early detection is so critical.
And technology has played a huge role there.
A massive role. The leap forward provided by newborn screening, specifically tandem mass spectrometry, is now routine. It lets us detect trace amounts of these catabolites, these breakdown products.
That flag a problem.
Exactly, using just a few drops of a newborn's blood. It's truly life-saving technology, and it's rooted in understanding these exact pathways.
So at the molecular level, what's causing these inborn errors? Is it always just a complete shutdown of an enzyme?
Not always a complete shutdown, no. It's more of a serious compromise.
Yeah.
We're talking about a mutation that messes with an enzyme's structure, or its catalytic efficiency, or maybe its regulatory sites, like allosteric regulation.
Okay.
And what's crucial to understand is that different molecular diseases, meaning different specific mutations, can actually present with the same clinical signs.
So understanding the specific block is key.
It's the only way to manage it, often by something as simple as restricting that one problematic amino acid in the diet.
So our mission today is to follow the carbon skeletons of all 20 protein amino acids, identify the final products, and, crucially, map the metabolic blocks linked to disease. Let's start with the big picture. What are the ultimate fates of these skeletons?
Let's categorize them. Nutritional studies going way back, like almost a century ago, established this idea of interconvertibility.
Meaning the carbons from amino acids can turn into other things.
Exactly. They can be converted into intermediates, they can yield carbohydrate, fat, or sometimes both. This classification really determines if that amino acid is acting as immediate fuel or a building block for storage.
So we have the three classic buckets.
Yep. First up, the glycogenic amino acids. These form intermediates that can be routed into gluconeogenesis to make carbohydrate.
And their end products are things we'd recognize from the citric acid cycle.
Things like pyruvate, oxaloacetate, alpha-ketoglutarate, succinyl-CoA, or fumarate. Think of alanine, serine, glycine, and proline in this group.
Then you have the ketogenic amino acids, which are destined for fat synthesis, yielding acetyl-CoA or acetoacetyl-CoA.
And that's a very small, very exclusive group, just leucine and lysine.
And finally, the mixed group, glycogenic and ketogenic.
Right. These give you products that can form both carbohydrate and fat. That would be isoleucine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, and tyrosine.
Now, you said the general rule is that catabolism starts with transamination.
It does. Removing that alpha-amino group is step one. But, chemistry reminds us that not all amino acids play by that role. There are 4 exceptions that skip that initial step.
Who are the rule breakers?
Proline, hydroxyproline, threonine, and lysine. They remove their nitrogen through different chemical processes.
Let's look at the amino acids whose pathways are the most direct, leading straight into the citric acid cycle, starting with asparagine and glutamine.
These are the fast tracks. Asparagine is quickly converted to aspartate by asparaginase, and then a transaminase just swaps the group to make oxaloacetate.
And glutamine is similar.
Same story. Glutamase converts it to glutamate, and a transaminase converts that to alpha-ketoglutarate. Simple.
We call those amphibolic, right? They're constantly feeding both breakdown and buildup pathways.
Exactly.
Does that central role explain why we rarely, if ever, see clinical defects in these 2 short pathways?
Precisely. They are so fundamental to cellular function, feeding the energy cycle and providing building blocks, that a defect there is probably just incompatible with life. The body can't tolerate a block in such a core hub.
Okay, so moving away from the simple ones, let's tackle an exception, proline. Since it doesn't transaminate, how does the body handle its ring structure?
Proline catabolism is a mitochondrial process. It's a two-stage oxidation that, interestingly, keeps the alpha-amino nitrogen in place until the very end product, which is glutamate.
So what are the steps?
First, proline dehydrogenase creates a compound called delta-pyrroline 5-carboxylate. Then a second oxidation finishes the job, yielding glutamate.
And both of those steps are potential points of failure.
They are. A defect of proline dehydrogenase causes type I hyperprolinemia, which is usually benign. But a block in the second step is more clinically significant.
Why is that?
That causes type 2 hyperprolinemia, which is more complex because that same enzyme is also involved in processing arginine, ornithine, and hydroxyproline, so you get excretion of multiple problematic compounds.
Speaking of arginine and ornithine, their pathways feed right into that proline pathway, correct?
They do. Arginine first yields ornithine via arginase. That's a familiar enzyme from the urea cycle. Ornithine then gets converted to glutamate gamma-samyaldehyde, and from there it's just like proline catabolism ending in alpha-ketoglutarate.
And there's a clinical correlation there too.
Yes, a block in the ornithine delta aminotransferase causes a defect called gyrate atrophy of the choroid and retina, which thankfully can be managed by restricting dietary arginine.
Okay, last one in this alpha-ketoglutarate group, histidine. You mentioned it has a fantastic clinical hook.
Histidine is fascinating. It goes through several intermediates urocanate, 4-imidazolone, 5-propionate, before it generates something called not-a-formimidoglutamate. We just call it FIGLU.
FIGLU, got it.
And that FIGLU step is where the clinical utility is. To transfer the formimino group from FIGLU, you need the micronutrient folic acid.
So if a patient is deficient in folic acid, that reaction stalls.
Exactly. So if you give a patient a dose of histidine and then you find FIGLU in their urine, it's diagnostic for folic acid deficiency.
That's a powerful link between a complex pathway and a simple nutrient issue.
It really is.
That's a great piece of knowledge to carry forward. Now let's shift gears and look at the amino acids that lead directly to pyruvate and acetyl-CoA. Let's start with tiny glycine.
Glycine is small, but it's metabolically huge. Its catabolism relies heavily on what's called the glycine cleavage system in liver mitochondria.
So not just one simple enzyme.
Not at all. It's a complex, multi-component machine.
Which sounds functionally similar to other big multi-enzyme complexes we know, like pyruvate dehydrogenase.
It is complex, yeah, but the result is key for the body. Glycine gets broken down into three very simple products, TextTO2, TextNH4 plus dollars, and critically a single carbon unit carried by tetrahydrofolate. And that single carbon unit is essential for tons of biosynthetic reactions.
So what happens when that system fails?
A defect in the glycine cleavage system causes a condition called non-ketotic hyperglycinemia, or NKH. Glycine builds up to toxic levels in the central nervous system.
And there's another disease linked to glycine, right? Primary hyperoxaluria.
That's right. Glycine catabolism can also lead to an intermediate called glyoxylate. If that isn't catabolized properly, it gets oxidized into oxalate, which is insoluble and forms stones.
Kidney stones.
Nasty ones. That's primary hyperoxaluria. Leads to urolithiasis, nephrocalcinosis, and often early mortality from kidney failure.
The connections are just everywhere. Serine feeds into glycine. Alanine is the simplest transamination to pyruvate. So central, there's no known defect. What about threonine?
Threonine is cleaved by threonine aldolase, and that yields glycine and acetaldehyde. The acetaldehyde is then oxidized to acetate, which becomes acetyl-CoA.
Okay, next up, cysteine and cysteine, leading to pyruvate. We start with a reduction, right?
Correct. Cysteine, which is the disulfide dimer, has to be reduced first to 2 molecules of cysteine. Cysteine then follows its major catabolic route, the cysteine sulfonate pathway, and that eventually yields pyruvate.
And the diseases here are pretty well known to anyone studying for health professions.
They are. First is cystinuria. Now, this isn't actually a catabolic defect. It's a defect in renal tubular reabsorption.
So the kidneys just can't pull it back in.
Exactly. So cysteine and other basic amino acids, lysine, arginine, ornithine, they just spill into the urine. It's generally benign, except for the massive problem of cysteine calculi, which are very insoluble kidney stones.
And the second major one, the one linked to that controversial cardiovascular risk.
That would be homocystinuria. This is a deficiency in an enzyme called cystathionine beta synthase, which normally combines serine and homocysteine.
When it fails, homocysteine builds up.
It accumulates, leading to osteoporosis and severe mental retardation. Now, the cardiovascular link is controversial because while high homocysteine is associated with higher risk, trials using B vitamins and folic acid to lower it haven't consistently reduced heart attacks or strokes.
A classic case of correlation versus causation.
It's a perfect illustration of it in metabolism.
That is valuable context. Let's move on to the aromatic amino acids. These are probably the most famous targets for inherited metabolic defects. Let's start with tyrosine. It's both glycogenic and ketogenic.
Right. It yields both fumarate and acetoacetate. The tyrosine pathway is a four-step sequence. It starts with transamination, then conversion to homogentisate, then malonyl acetoacetate, and then finally cleavage into its two end products.
And diseases can strike at almost every step, but let's focus on the most significant ones.
Absolutely. The list is long, but the real cornerstone of this field is the defect in the third step, alkaptonuria.
The famous case that Sir Archibald Garrod used to establish the entire concept of inborn errors of metabolism.
A century ago, yes. Alkaptonuria is caused by a defective homogentisate oxidase. Without this enzyme, homogentisate builds up and is excreted in the urine.
And the hallmark sign.
The urine turns black. It darkens dramatically when it's exposed to air because the homogentisate oxidizes.
And later in life.
It leads to arthritis and a black pigmentation of connective tissue called ochronosis. Garrod actually traced this disease's history back to a 1500 BC Egyptian mummy.
Wow.
It just demonstrates the incredible genetic stability of these defects over millennia.
Tracing a metabolic block that far back really brings the history of science to life. What about phenylalanine? It has to become tyrosine first, right?
Correct. Phenylalanine must first be converted to tyrosine via phenylalanine hydroxylase. After that, the reactions are just the tyrosine pathway, but that initial conversion is the step that most often goes wrong.
Leading to type I, or classic phenylketonuria, PKU.
Correct. PKU has a frequency of about 1 in 10,000 births. When that hydroxylase enzyme is defective, phenylalanine accumulates, and high levels are very toxic to the developing brain.
And this just underscores why that compulsory newborn screening is so essential.
The difference between a normal adult life and severe mental retardation hangs entirely on early detection and intervention. The goal of treatment is a strict, lifelong diet low in phenylalanine, and it is remarkably effective.
And it replaced older, less reliable methods.
Thankfully, yes. It's now supplanted the old Texelfi-43 test with modern mass spectrometry.
This is fascinating. We go from a rule follower to a rule breaker, lysine. Its catabolism is unique because, as we said, neither of its nitrogen atoms participates in that initial transamination.
Lysine is truly complex. The process involves forming an intermediate called saccharpine, which liberates the epsilon nitrogen. Then later reactions remove the alpha nitrogen.
And this complex job is handled by one multitasking enzyme.
A huge multitasking bifunctional enzyme called amino adipate delta semialdehyde synthase.
Wow, that is some serious efficiency. What's the final fate of lysine's carbon skeleton?
The ultimate carbon product is crotonyl-CoA, which gets reduced to butynyl-CoA, and that routes the skeleton directly into the fatty acid breakdown pathway.
And a defect there is also serious.
Very. A defect in the final steps is associated with severe striatal and cortical degeneration.
Okay, finally, let's tackle the branched-chain amino acids, or BCAAs, valine, leucine, and isoleucine.
The breakdown of these three is very closely analogous to fatty acid catabolism. It follows three critical shared initial reactions.
So that's the first one.
First, they undergo transamination, forming the respective alpha-keto acids. Second, and this is the most critical one clinically, is oxidative decarboxylation.
Analogy alert. This is catalyzed by the mitochondrial branched-chain alpha-keto acid dehydrogenase complex, BCKDH.
Yes, and structurally, the BCKDH complex is functionally identical to the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. It has the same three components, E1, E2, E3.
And it's regulated the same way, too.
It is, by phosphorylation, which inactivates it, and dephosphorylation, which activates it. And the third shared step is dehydrogenation, which again mirrors the steps in lipid breakdown.
And when that central BCKDH complex fails, we get one of the most serious metabolic disorders.
That's maple syrup urine disease, or MSUD. The name comes from the very characteristic distinctive odor of the urine.
Smells like maple syrup or burnt sugar.
Exactly. The defect is a failure in that BCKDH complex, that oxidative decarboxylation step.
So what toxic compounds build up because of that blockage?
Plasma and urinary levels of all three BCAAs, leucine, isoleucine, and valine, along with their alpha-keto acids, become dangerously high.
And the result?
If it's untreated, it's fatal ketoacidosis, severe neurological problems, and profound mental retardation. It's also complicated by what we call molecular heterogeneity, meaning mutations in any of the different component genes can cause the disease.
And we see milder versions of this.
We do. Intermittent branch-chain ketonuria is a subtype where the enzyme retains some residual activity, so the symptoms are delayed. We also have isovaleric acidemia, which is a defect in the very next step.
So after the decarboxylation.
Right. When those patients ingest protein, the resulting elevation of isovalerate can trigger vomiting, severe acidosis, and even coma.
So if we zoom out for a second, what this massive catalog of pathways really boils down to is metabolic routing.
That's it. The body has to route these carbon skeletons toward one of two essential endpoints, either immediate energy production via the citrate cycle, or diverting them for biosynthesis to make glucose or lipids.
So what does this all mean for you listening? The immense clinical consequence of a single enzyme failure, whether it's the homogentisate oxidase in alkaptonuria or the total failure of the BCKDH complex in MSUD, it just shows the critical importance of these specific, discrete biochemical steps.
And it's why understanding the textbook pathway literally saves lives when you apply it through newborn screening technologies like tandem mass spectrometry.
Absolutely.
And if you look back at the elegance of the regulation, that the activity of a complex like BCKDH can be switched on and off just by adding or removing a single phosphate group.
It raises an important question.
Which is,
What other seemingly minor steps in metabolism governing the fate of these essential nutrients are regulated this critically, holding the balance between a normal life and a profound neurological disorder?
it shows just how finely tuned our metabolic machine truly is. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the metabolic fate of amino acid carbons.